Good afternoon. Welcome to Richmond Art Gallery's online conversation with Emily Neufeld, Cease Wyss, and Amy Norgaard. I am Nan Capogna, the curator at Richmond Art Gallery. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that although we may be zooming in from various locations, the land the Richmond Art Gallery occupies is the traditional and ancestral territory of the Hunkaminam-speaking peoples. This is the language spoken by the Musqueam and many of the nations along the Fraser River Delta. We recognize our institution currently occupies and operates in this traditional territory, and we are very grateful for the opportunity to create, live, and work on this land. So the context for today's discussion is Emily Neufeld's exhibition at Richmond Art Gallery, Prairie Invasions, a Lullaby. Emily Neufeld was born in Alberta on Treaty 6 and 7 lands and now lives and works on the unceded territory of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam in North Vancouver. Her practice investigates place in how humans change and are changed by the environment and the layers of memory and psychic history that accumulate in a material world. Emily has created and participates in community sharing gardens and sees land as fundamental to her research process. Behind me, part of the installation is a large photographic wall of a farm near Pike Lake southwest of Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, also known as Bruce's Farm. For this project, Emily traveled to a dozen farmhouses over the summer of 2018 as part of her research. There are just a few of the many deserted homes punctuating the Canadian prairies, built by settler migrant farmers who came in waves during the 1800s and which form part of the complex history of colonization in Canada. As the decades passed, many of the family farms became conglomerates of larger holdings of farmers retired and farmers or farmhouses that were left behind. Prairie Invasions focuses on 6 homes, 4 in Saskatchewan and 2 in Alberta. Once Emily is on a farm site, she responds intuitively, attending to what catches her attention. She undertakes various activities, performing interventions, moving and working with natural and human-made materials that she finds in and around the houses. She also creates sculptures from the materials, likening her actions to funerary rites. Before leaving, she documents the evidence of her actions in photographs and leaves the sculptures to follow the same fate as the house. Emily's engagement with the Canadian prairies is genuine. She was born and raised in Alberta. Her great-grandparents were Mennonites arriving in Canada in 1874 from the Russian Empire. They farmed land deemed non-arable along with thousands of other migrants. The prairies came to be the home of over 21,000 Mennonites who arrived between 1923 and 1930, aided by the Canadian Mennonite Board of Colonization and the Canadian Pacific Railway. With this project, Emily works within the tensions of a colonial reality as a settler and as an artist. There is a tenderness in the curious efforts Emily makes with the houses, thatching a roof with farm grasses, moving barn swallows' nests to an alcove, tacking a bedroom wall with dozens of native brown-eyed Susans from a nearby ditch, or creating a final repository for bulrushes gathered from outside. Her care and interest in the memories embedded in a place carries over to the land and into the soil. The notion of soil segues into today's discussion. When considering what the topic would be, Emily wished to invite Cesa Weiss and Amy Norgaard. Now, we are having a little technical difficulty. Cesa has not been able to log in yet. I think what I will do is I will introduce Amy, and then if Cesa is able to join us, then I can read Cesa's bio as well. Amy Norgaard is a 2015 graduate of the UBC Farm Practicum and is currently completing a Master of Science in Soil Science in the Sustainable Agricultural Landscapes Lab at UBC. The goal of her research is to help organic farms meet their goal of producing food with a reduced environmental impact through enhanced nutrient management. She is a professional agrologist and teaches sustainable soil management with the KPU Tsawwassen First Nations Farms School. I am pleased to welcome our panelists, Amy and Emily right now. And so I'm turning this over to Emily.
Yeah, welcome. Thank you. So I have been making work in homes slated for demolition in the lower mainland of Vancouver, as well as these abandoned farmhouses across Alberta and Saskatchewan now for 10 years about. And over the process, I'm thinking a lot about domestic life and how humans kind of integrate with their surroundings, whether that's their homes, their yards, their neighborhoods, the farms that they kind of live on, and thinking a lot about those sorts of questions and all kinds of different ways that we interact with our surroundings. And yeah, for the purposes of this chat today, I was really excited to invite Amy and Cease to join us for the purposes of talking more about kind of farming here in BC, in the lower mainland, in Richmond, as well as on the prairies, and sort of how we interact with the land as we're farming and as we're growing our food. And so one of the things that kind of comes up in my art practice, in the work that I make, is sort of soil as being a very foundational substance. It's sort of a community. Like, I think of soil as being a community of organisms that sort of all kind of are living together to create a substrate that not only is our carbon sink, you know, it's all of our food grows from it. It's literally the foundation under our homes and under our roads and our structures. And it's this very important substance that we fairly regularly just kind of ignore or try not to think about. So yeah, I'm really interested kind of in hearing from Amy and Cease in regards to kind of the fundamental nature of soil and how we as people think about it and treat it in not only our farming practices, but also our gardening and just the way that we live. And just, you know, some of the practices that we do on a daily basis about thinking about the soil around us, like washing our car in our driveway, and like some of these things that we don't think about how we're affecting the soil around us and these communities that are actually really important. And so yeah, you can sort of see that in some of the work, like my table work, where there's the pile of soil underneath the table is sort of like talk about this kind of like, it's like the foundation underneath. And also in a lot of my work, I highlight sort of the growth medium as well as the plants. Like the plants are, you know, sitting on top of like the growth medium, and sort of that's highlighted in the artwork. So yeah, I'm trying to draw attention to it and try to point out the fact that this is a necessary part that often kind of gets hidden away. Just how it is. So yeah, Amy, I don't know if you want to share some thoughts or ideas about that.
Awesome. Thanks, Emily, for that introduction. Definitely the role of soil. I think that's when I first started studying soils, maybe 5-7 years ago. I think that's what caught me and drew me to it, was just that how much of our lives it could explain, and also that it contributes to, as you've already mentioned, it's providing all of these functions society that we never stop to think about. And you mentioned a couple, but even beyond that, like it's filtering our water, it's regulating like natural ecosystems, like beyond just like what we care about. I guess, although we do care about obviously about filtered water, but just as humans, there's a bunch of things we put value to, such as wood production, and so we have wood for houses, food production, fiber, so we have clothes to wear. Those are some things that we care about, but it also is like a foundation for moderating a lot of just general I guess ecosystem processes that are happening in nature. And you also alluded to another one. It's a huge carbon sink in this like larger scheme of climate change and greenhouse gas production, sequestration. And in that, I was trying to think in preparation for today, how to really convey that uniqueness. Because now that I've worked with soil, it's almost, I kind of even take that magic maybe for granted even at this point in my career, where I forget how beautiful it is. And so being able to kind of think and reflect on that was a really cool opportunity, as I said, in preparing for today. And it really is unique. As you've said, we really are, all of these processes are only happening because of that very thin layer of soil on basically bedrock and the rest of what makes up our planet. And it is just that all of these, it's kind of all of the pieces come together perfectly in kind of a very, one of those ways where we just can't understand nature, and how all of these little mineral particles interact to actually create perfect physics. It can filter water in a certain way where the water doesn't drain, but it does drain slowly, or it doesn't drain too quickly. It also doesn't drain too slowly. There's also a lot of chemistry happening there where those mineral particles are so small that there's actually chemical reactions that are allowing for the nutrient cycling, the habitat for all the biology that's happening in the as well. It really is kind of one of those things where you try and piece it apart and you realize how much we just don't understand.
So I'm just going to interrupt here because Cesa's been able to get the technology to work. Hi, Cesa. So glad that you've been able to join us. T'uy't'tanat-Cease Wyss is of Squamish, Solo, Irish, Métis, Hawaiian, and Swiss descent. She is an interdisciplinary artist who works with new media, performance, and interdisciplinary arts, and is a community engaged and public artist. Her works range over 25 years and have always focused on sustainability, Coast Salish cultural elements, and have included themes of ethnobotany and digital media technology. Cesa has recently been focused on connecting to her Polynesian roots through weaving and digital media projects, and has been collaborating with more Oceania people. Cesa was given the name T'uy't'tanat, meaning woman who travels by canoe to gather medicines for all people. So I think what I will do now, Emily, is to kind of turn it back over to you. And again, welcome, Cesa.
Sure. So we were just talking about soil as like foundational for life. So yeah, I don't know if you want to add to that, or you know, talk about, you know, as gardeners as well, like how we think about kind of the soil in our own gardens. And I know I'm always, you know, thinking about, you know, composting my, you know, my food scraps and stuff, but also like about like the kinds of things that I'm using, like for example, like washing my car, or when I'm, you know, dumping out, you know, paintbrush water kind of a thing from my studio, kind of how I'm trying to like think about what I do, you know, to protect the sort of soil in a way that like also is practical in our world where I do have dirty paintbrush water, and, you know, kind of these sorts of ideas. Yeah. So yeah, do you want to jump in there, Cesa, or?
Yeah, sure. Well, soil I see as the decolonial state of what Earth is. And I say that because dirt is colonized. Dirt is void of nutrients, of anything that can feed life. Hold on. Come on in if you need to.
Oh, sorry.
I'm on a Zoom.
It's okay.
It's a big family here. And I think of soil as the decolonial state of what Earth is, where we feed it the composting materials, and we feed it the. Hold on a second, you guys. Can you all just talk with softer voices? Sorry, getting caught in their conversation. Yeah, and so I see soil as something that's rich and filled with nutrients, and I see dirt as void of any nutrients. And so building soil and healing soil is about really decolonizing ourselves through the process of building what becomes rich, humus, nutrient-rich, dark material. And dirt is often gray, and it has gray or white. It has a lot of rocks in it, but it doesn't have a lot of nutrients that will nurture and feed soft and hard roots. So yeah, I'll just start with that.
Yeah, that's
I
amazing.
might mute because it's a loud house. So if
Yeah,
I
for
mute,
sure, for
it's
sure.
just that I just don't want you guys to have to get caught in the family dynamics here.
That's great. Yeah, and I think that really nicely segues kind of into like another thing that I'm thinking about in my practices is kind of our human kind of control of like dirt or soil, and how, you know, it does it, like dirt accumulates in our homes and accumulates in our houses, and we have this like love-hate relationship with it, where we try to like get rid of it all the time out of our homes, but or put it in like a pot and grow a plant, but like, you know, sort of these ideas of kind of controlling nature, as opposed to sort of like living in a more sharing back and forth kind of relationship with the natural. And I think, you know, also with farming, that there's a lot of like, we think we can just put these things input into our soil, and then we'll get these things, you know, output from the soil, instead of sort of thinking more like Cesa was saying, like about how we can like add to it in a way that's just for its own sake and not necessarily just for what we can get out of it. And I don't know, like I have like I people make fun of me sometimes because of how obsessed I get with compost, and then I actually could, like, I feel this like I want to eat it, or I want to like love it kind of. And
Make it compost tea and
yeah, totally.
feed it and nurture it, because everything we put into the earth to grow our food is the love that grows our food, right? It's not just, you know, watering it every day, making sure there's enough sun, there's enough liquid, there's enough space to grow, but it's the love that we put into the work we do. And believe it or not, throwing scraps of rotting food into the earth and smelly fish guts is
Love.
very loving, and
True love. Absolutely.
it's true love all the way.
I even had someone think that when I was making compost tea that I was making it because I was going to drink it. Like, and they were like, "Emily, that's too far." Like, no. I'm like, I'm not going to drink it. It's for the garden.
Yeah, the way I make compost tea is I just well, I've often used those big black composting things from the city, so it's kind of easy. Then you just start filling it up with water. But the first thing I do is pick a whole bunch of comfrey and throw that in there, and then I pitchfork it in, and like, gardening's really good for you. It just gets rage out and it gets frustrations out, and you're like breaking up the stuff, and you're making holes in there, and then you spray some water in, and then you let it cook on a hot sunny day, and then it becomes a tea, and it helps to break down everything in there. And comfrey is fantastic because it's a really great nutrient builder and nitrogen builder, and it helps to break the soil. It breaks the compost down and helps it expedite it into what becomes soil. So it's really cool.
Amy, maybe you can speak to composting in the practice that you do and in your work.
Yeah, for sure. I think also even just dichotomy of dirt versus soil. I find it really interesting, and I love hearing non-soil scientists speak so passionately about this dichotomy, because it is really important, and definitely a substantial joke in the soil science community, which is small, but I'm still calling it a community. It's offensive to a soil to tell that I'm studying dirt. So it's what's under your fingernails, it's what's on your car, it's what's on your clothes when you come in. Like, that's dirt. And this distinction that Cesa is discussing, it really is that dirt it's lifeless, and it doesn't have these dynamic qualities to it, and it really is that inert substance. Whereas soil, it to do all these functions that we've been previously discussing, it is because it's alive, and not in some magical way that I think me and Emily and I think Cesa also kind of share, that this magic that is in it, but actually literally it's alive. It's doing all these functions because the microbes are decomposing the compost. Like, if we didn't have that habitat for those microbes, like, our earth would actually just be a huge garbage pile or a big compost pile, with that not going anywhere, and not that nutrient cycling is happening because of those microbes. So literally the life of the soil is doing these processes for us to have the life that we have. And I guess in terms of compost, I also love that this discussion is turning to that, and that Emily has that passion, and Cease as well. That's pretty much what I've been studying for the last 2 years. I'm doing a Master of Soil Science, but because my research is in agriculture and I work with organic farmers, a lot of what I've been studying has been to do with composts, and in some cases manures, if that's what farmers are using, and basically looking at the nutrient dynamics that happen after that and how that feeds into this conception of soil health, and how do we measure those things? How does it affect crop productivity, which is basically comes back to nutrient cycling. And yeah, I guess I could get into it in the same way that Emily and Cesa are, but I feel like they've already spoken to the magic of compost. So maybe I'll leave it there in discussing my research.
Yeah, so I mean, kind of that makes me think about, like, in these COVID times, in this pandemic, I'm having a bit of a hard mental shift, because I don't like antibacterial things. I don't like hand sanitizers. I always think about how those, even our bodies are full of microbes that we rely on for many bodily functions, and our soils and all these things. So how are you thinking about that, Amy? Or do you have any, or Cease, do you guys have any insights as to kind of how you're adjusting your thoughts to be like anti-COVID without being anti every other bacteria that we love and want?
Right, that's a good question. And I'd say I'm the same. I like fully embrace the living microbiome that we are as humans. I think that I'm sure I've heard the stats, and I'm going to be another one of those people who's like perpetuating the incorrect stats. So I won't put any numbers to it, but I know, I think that there's more bacterial and viral cells in our body than there are human cells. I won't put any numbers to it because I'll guess completely wrong. But yeah, for sure, that's how we function as human beings. And I think we are seeing like lots of diseases and stuff that come from when we disrupt that kind of delicate balance of ecology in our own bodies. And we do see it in agriculture, and I think that that's one of those things where, like you said, we thought that we figured out the whole input output system of, we figured out some macronutrients that plants needed and some micronutrients, and we just figured that that was all it was. And we didn't even this concept of soil health and soil quality, when we started realizing that there was more to producing crops than just putting in these nutrients and having crops come out, then we went to this concept of soil quality. But soil quality is still speaking to, and when you look into the nuances of these definitions in the literature, soil quality still has this inherent lifelessness to it. It's kind of like measuring the physics of something, or like these physical qualities, versus now we're trying to discuss this from a soil health perspective. And you actually see academics debating these two terms that seem so similar, soil quality and soil health, but they're still trying to push us in this direction of that we should call it soil health, because it needs to have this biological component to it, and that's really important. And in terms of looking at these impacts of having this kind of, you've already mentioned like this idea of like control, and where we think that we've got something figured out, and we can just reduce it down to this input output, and these impacts on that microbiome of the soil. We see processes. So not only, I guess like an easy example is obviously like pesticides and some of these things having impacts on things that we're not intending to impact. Like you said, like the COVID virus, I guess it's a virus, but in the case when we take like an antibiotic for one bacteria, well, you're not just like targeting that bacteria, you're oftentimes taking these broad spectrums. So that's an obvious example. But we even see when we put on too much of a nutrient, we actually downregulate natural cycles that happen. So when we put on too much, there's a whole craze about like fungi right now. Everybody loves mycelium. These are really important, especially in like forest ecosystems, for cycling phosphorus. But it's the same in vegetable production, where we see if you put on too much phosphorus, we actually downregulate those fungal networks. And it's easy to say, well, you don't need them anymore because you're putting on the phosphorus. But those fungal networks actually, they also bring water to the plant. They also can fight off other bad pests, I guess we could say. And so, yeah, there really are these like bigger ramifications where I really do think that like that soil ecosystem, because it's literally digesting, and what Cease was talking about, it's digesting all that compost and giving nutrients to your plant. And that's exactly what our stomachs do, and our intestines is like all of those bacteria are literally digesting the food, and then we absorb it into our cells. And so it's to me it's a completely identical system basically.
And Cease, maybe you want to say something to that as well.
Yeah, I just forgot I had it on mute, so I realized I had to. Yeah, it's always interesting to me to hear scientific perspectives, because I do find that science and Indigenous epistemologies really are on the same level, that we are observing things, we are you know, making calculations based on what we've seen in the past, and projections of what we think are coming ahead. And so you know, I think it's funny when people ask me, well, what are you going to do if a scientist disproves you? I'm like, I've actually never seen a scientist disprove Indigenous knowledge. It's just, as you flowed into it and agreed, that's what I find science and Indigenous beliefs are very much on, you know, the same level. They're not parallel, they're on the same level, and they are they might be parallel in that they're drawing from different streams, but from different forms of knowledge and knowledge transfer. One is an oral, you know, way of doing things, and one is writing down statistics and storing it in computers. But in the end, it's all very similar how it comes around and how it works. So I just think more of that. We just need to do more work that supports one another in looking at how we protect the environment and how we steward land and water systems through our research and through our knowledge that we bring to the table. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'd actually like to add to that, and thanks for bringing those perspectives and like actually stating those outright. I think that Emily and I discussed this previously in terms of, and I guess what a bit of in the work where I see what you're discussing, I call it farmer intuition. So the intuition of these people that have spent some time on the land that they're on now, very short periods of time compared to the land managers, of course, that have come before us. But it is this important piece. And like you said, the science is really just kind of catching up. And I'm not even surprised that you've never been disproved by science, because it often is that there's this intuition that we can learn, but you do need to spend time observing patterns and being in a place for a certain amount of time. And the way this came up actually in conversation with Emily previously was that because there's a pattern happening now where even farmers who have the best stewardship principles in mind and want to be farming in that way, it still can be a gamble in terms of if you don't have access to land and you're just leasing and you have a short-term lease, then what's the point of putting in some of these kind of like extra practices that pay off in 10 or 20 years and aren't paying off in that next year when you're in like the length of the term of your lease. And it really is important to kind of somehow get back to a way of managing the land that recognizes, I guess, even coming back to the theme of this exhibit, that we do leave a memory or an imprint on the land that we're on. And unfortunately right now, that the way that just society operates, that's pushing us in kind of an incorrect direction often, and kind of needing to bring that back to operating in this longer term vision, which is definitely being a way that the land has been managed in the past.
Now, Emily, I know you had a couple of other things that you wanted to kind of traverse, so I'm going to let you lead on this. Thank you.
That's really great, Amy. That's really, I think that, like, yeah, sort of thinking about memory or the trace of history that, you know, accumulates in a place. And I think that that's super evident in a domestic space, like in a home. Like you can see the sort of, you know, the outline on the wall where the picture hung, that the sun bleached away the wallpaper around it, kind of a thing. But I think that same kind of idea of, like, you know, traces of past lives, you know, can be seen in the soil, and in the land itself. And in a lot of the homes I went to on the prairies, you could see like the caragana that they planted as like a shelter break around the field. You know, it's kind of gone out of control toward the farmhouse. Like the fields are still being farmed, so it's still kind of maintained on that side, but on the farmhouse side, it's just grown wild and into the house, and those sorts of like imprints of a a plant that was put there specifically by a farmer now that has sort of taken over the entire yard. Is sort of an example of that, and then how how that changes the soil of the yard, and even planting like our lawns as opposed to like what was there before, and the memory of those lawns and how long it takes the sort of like ditch grasses to kind of grow in and cover up the like lawn grasses. And I have a friend who does some anthropology work around the province, and she says often you can see what community lived in an area by what traces you can see in their gardens. You can see different plants that are grown in one garden. You can kind of know a little bit about what community they're from. So I think that's a super interesting, and just by virtue of what plants you do grow, like comfrey, it changes the composition of the soil as well. So the soil would carry some of that memory in its nutrients, kind of a thing, which is a pretty amazing thing to think about. But yeah, I know, Amy, you had some really interesting things to say about sort of soil memory as well, and I'm sure Cesa's got loads to say too. I also remember Cesa talking a little bit about the salmon kind of, and how we can see traces of the salmon in the soil on the west coast as well. So yeah.
Yeah, I'd be curious. Cease, do you have anything to add to that? I'd love to hear the salmon story.
Oh, probably the salmon story is about.
Sorry,
I'm trying to use my iPhone to hold my iPad so it doesn't slip, and it is making Siri talk to me. Like, just don't talk. I think the story you mean is the reference to David Suzuki's work. Is that it, Emily? Yeah. So yeah, like I mean, I do a lot of walking in the forest, and I do a lot of observing of things I see, and I always see different things like bones and shells. Even when you're really inland, I see shells in the forest, and I know that those come from birds. I know that people aren't actually just taking a handful of shells and going to the bush and throwing them. I know that's like, especially ravens are running around grabbing shells and then going deep into the forest and dropping them on boulders and rock faces to smash them open so they can get into the delicious treats inside. And when they do that, they make that connection between the forest and the ocean. And so it was not surprising to me when David Suzuki decided to do a genealogical test on cedar. And so he took a clipping from a cedar bough from the top of a 900-year-old cedar. So it was probably about 60 to 80 feet high, maybe more, maybe even 100 feet high. And then he just took the littlest clipping off a bough at the very top of the tree and put it through his lab, and he found salmon DNA in the cedar. And so it is a very, again, we know as Indigenous people that eagles and ravens and other birds, carry the seafood from the shores and drop it in the forest and eat it. And it's like they get it away from the shoreline so they're not being bothered by a bunch of pesky other birds coming in and trying to steal their food. But it also has other relevance for them, and often it's close to their nest, or maybe it's even in their nest, and then bits fall out and they get into the earth that the tree is growing from, and they become part of that tree. And so, and it's not far-fetched for most people in agricultural backgrounds and master gardeners and even basic entry-level gardeners know that seafood is one of the best fertilizers for anything you're growing, anything. And, in our worldview as Indigenous people, we believe that we're not the only stewards of the land. We know that the wildlife is also part of stewardship on the land, and that, dropping those shells in the forest feeds the big trees, feeds the smaller plant life underneath, and feeds more than anything the soil that becomes the nutrients that feed everything. And going back to what you're saying about the mycelium, yeah, like plants speak to each other through their root system. So mycorrhiza attached with connected with mycelium and with different layers of soil, and the bugs that all travel, the little creatures that go back and forth and nibble, and things get caught on their legs and they transfer. And that's how especially trees converse with one another, is through that Wi-Fi of the forest, so to speak. And it makes everything communicable. And even the idea of the World Wide Web is all based in natural world philosophies. You'll find spiders and worms in the web. You'll everything. The fact it's called the web, it's referring to the interconnectedness of like a spider's web and what that represents. And fiber optics, everything that goes into technology today is all based in the oldest technology, which is plant technology. And it's undeniable, because it really is about what the people like you and I are doing now. And we're doing this work because we're passionate about it and we love it. And for both of us, it is how we make our living, is doing that work with the soil and understanding it and helping educate others about it. So it becomes intrinsic to draw off of all these values, and not just, say, oh, I need to read research. Well, you're always going to be reading scientific research. And then a lot of times with scientists, they are, stumbling across Indigenous knowledge, and however that presents itself to them, whether they hear about it or actually find research that connects it. And it becomes apparent that all of this is interconnected, and it is interconnected because of the simplicity of what is going on in nature every single day. And that is the earth naturally on its own, through plant materials, is consistently feeding itself and putting nutrition into its bloodstreams, its waterways, its the sap in trees, the mycelium under the forest. So all those things are all one and the same, of they all have their own gifts that they bring to build soil, to strengthen it, to make it powerful. And as I often say to people, we go out in the forest and talk to each other, and as humans, we're very human centric, like we're the ones talking, blah, 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 blah in the forest, right? But everything out there is talking about us. And the most apparent way is ravens following us and, making their little clicking sounds and acknowledging to us that they're there. Eagles, whistling, everything out there, the birds chirping. It gives us an idea as humans, oh yeah, the wildlife knows we're here, but they don't actually think about the deeper philosophy that the trees are also talking about us being in the forest. As we walk on their root systems, they're talking to each other. And do you need more energy? That human just walked on your root and was jumping on it and doing things. Oh, that other human chopped the baby next to you. Do you need nutrients? So they send healing over to each other through their root systems. And and another thing, just like you see in the background, how the branches are all interconnected. Trees like to hold hands, and they like to hold hands with their own species and other species. And they're very much happier, and they're happiest when they're all hanging out, just like in your background there, Kathy, like it's gorgeous. So, like without the trees, without all these things that we see, we wouldn't know otherwise that this stuff was going on. And again, through scientific research, it's proven. It's these proven elements. And in Indigenous knowledge, it's also proven because it continues over centuries. And, you know, and anybody could say, oh, we're just saying what we've seen for centuries. And it's like, well, yeah, we are. That's part of our research. But the thing is, we were saying it before all those years of research were there. We knew because, you know I personally talk to the plants when I go into the forest, and I let them know I'm in the forest. I hug the trees, I touch. I am often heard saying, go fondle the foliage, you know, go touch everything out there, feel it, and like be sensual and feel what it is. Don't just touch it, feel it with a depth of meaning, you know, and be sensual, be loving, and be kind. Like we hear that so much today in this pandemic. Be kind to one another, stay calm. Well, the best way to do that is go out in the forest and hug a tree. Like you can't get much more into your kindest, most humble state than, you know, wrapping your arms around a centuries old being that has seen several epidemics, has seen several pandemics, has had its family wiped out through the greed of humans and capitalism. So the forest knows way more than we do, like more than humans will ever understand. We're going through, stumbling through, learning it, but the trees already know it. The plants already know it. And that's because they're the second oldest beings on the planet. You know, the rocks are the oldest. They are the oldest. They're the grandfathers. The plants are the grandmothers. And in all of our family lines, we know that the grandmothers are the ones that know the most. The grandmothers and the grandfathers hold the knowledge and help the next generation. But for sure, the grandmothers are the ones nurturing us. And so when you think about the wildlife and the plants and how they care for us, it is a family, and it is a community. It's a familial energy that goes through our spirits when we're in the forest, breathing the air, when we're walking on that earth, the tameach, the earth, and we are, whether we're barefoot or in shoes, layered up with socks, like we're still feeling it, and we can feel whether it's hard impacted or whether it's soft. You know, I went into this cedar forest a couple weeks ago, and everything was like on an angle, like let's see, it was almost like this, and in some places it was like this, but it was mostly like this. So I had to really hold things as I walked, and I actually had to hold hands with all these plants going in and out of this forest in order to not fall down the slippery slope, literally. And then I climbed into a 1,000 or a 1,500-year-old cedar tree that had become, you know, as many cedars do, rotten in the middle. And all that decayed substance had fallen down into the floor of the cedar stump inside. And when I went in, it was just like, I literally probably went from here down to here within seconds, because it was just soft, decaying, soft matter of the cedar tree. And these black bears had been living in there for a couple of winters. So they, you know, they're not there now because it's summer and it's too hot. But the whole forest is blanketed in blueberries, blue huckleberries, and they're going to come wandering back and nibble their way back to the places they live. And they're going to, you know, they're going to rest in that nice, gentle base of that decaying cedar that is going to keep them covered for the winter. And it's going to be soft and gentle and comforting. And, you know, and those trees, there are a number of trees that are housing bears inside them. And I was just, you know, really reminded of how delicate a forest like that is, and how much responsibility that we all need to feel to protect those spaces, because we're almost out of old growth forest, for sure, on the Pacific Northwest coast. We are down to the bare bones of it, literally. And those forests, everything is intact in those forests. Like the plant life is doing everything it's supposed to be doing. There's mushrooms everywhere. There's, you know, there's the scat from wolves and other animals that is also decaying and feeding the forest. So there's the mushrooms that pop up and then decay into the forest. So they're not just underneath, but everything that's going on, they're contributing to it all. And so that feels to me like, you know, that's why I call it a community. It's like everything has a role to protect itself, to make up this massive, beautiful entity, this community known as an old growth forest.
Yeah.
And then you go on to a cut block and there's, you know, the little plants are trying to grow through bark mulch, but they're struggling and they could disintegrate.
Excuse me, Cease. I have to do what I have to do now, and I'm so sorry.
Yeah,
I wish I could just. I wish you could keep going, but I'm mindful as the timekeeper. And somebody has just written in. Great discussion about soil and how interconnected everything is, which is really what you're talking about, Cease.
Mm-hmm.
And oops, I think I can't quite see that, Kathy. Sorry, I'm not in control of this. So, so and this Julie is saying, I know the prairies is the focus of the exhibition, but I think it's ironic the show is in Richmond. Having grown up in Richmond, were you aware of the incredible rich farmland that has been covered up by the rapid development of Richmond? Something that, you know, people who are living in Richmond, you know, North Van, Vancouver, wherever, would someone like to, now we only have a few minutes, but I would welcome anybody who wants to try to get a question in to respond to that. And maybe Emily, you would, since your show is here.
Yeah, yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, that was definitely part of the discussion with Nan when we decided to show in Richmond, that Richmond does have some of the richest farmland in Canada even. It's incredible because it is a river delta and there's actually no lakes source of the Fraser River until it hits the delta. So all the nutrients from the mountains and the forest get carried down to Richmond. So it's actually beautiful farmland. So yeah, that was definitely part of the decision to show this prairie work in Richmond and to sort of talk about farming here today. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And there is something else here. Somebody who teaches, and as a teacher, and you are all teachers. This person is interested to hear how you wish educators would focus on, and what would be the priority, and what would be the emphasis when learning and teaching about building relationships with our earth. So, you know, maybe each of you could just give just a very few minutes of how you would respond to that. A couple of, you know, what's a key point for you to impart? Because then there's another question, so maybe we'll be able to answer that as well. Thanks.
Yeah, I would just say to just, you know, we're not separate from our earth. Like we are it and it is us, and our, you know, we are just like, as he and Amy were saying, we have more bacteria cells in our bodies, the earth, like we're all part and parcel. So, you know, that's kind of the foundation for how I like to think about that question.
I just think that people need to do more land-based work with all ages. Like I work with all ages. I literally work with newborns to 99-year-olds is what I tell people, because everybody needs to get on the land and everybody needs to touch and feel things, get your fingernails dirty. All that stuff is important for our well-being, but also to really find our own humanity in the soil, in the earth, and to remind ourselves that one day we're going to be part of that. We are going to be part of that soil, whether we like it or not. You know, we can take all the anti-aging creams and drink every antioxidant on the planet. We can keep going. We're still going to, you know, we can dye our hair as much as we want to fool everybody, but we're eventually going back to the earth and we're going to decompose or we're going to be cremated, and we're still going to go back to the earth. So everything like that, we are going to be part of it, whether we think in our minds that we can, you know, freeze ourselves for a couple hundred years and come back, we'll still die eventually. So we have no choice but to make those connections to people as young as possible, but to every age group, and to be in constant dialogue about it. So.
And Amy, I mean, you go from farm to farm. I mean, I'm going to let you go ahead and respond. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that both of these questions actually tie together really well in terms of, I actually think that this is really the importance of Emily's exhibit, and like the perfect one with the kitchen table with the soil underneath it, of really acknowledging that this is the value of it, that we need this soil, we don't have a choice, we're attached to it, as Cesa is saying. And I think that goes hand in hand with the development of the soil. I worked for a nonprofit for a short period of time in Richmond, and I was there when some of these large decisions were being made on how to use the city lands, and I went to some of the council meetings, and it was a very heated debate. But at the end of the day, generally the economics of these things went out, and if we can't see that land for value to anything other than its real estate value, then that is what happens. And so I think that having Emily's exhibit here speak to that there's so much more value to that land and that memory of that land. I'm totally going to blank on his name, but I know anybody who's in this right now who's from Richmond, Harold Steves, and that is what he speaks to. And that I remember him being so furious that that irreversible decisions were being made, and as soon as this land is paved over, you can't go back. That soil, that topsoil, like it doesn't just, we can't turn that into a man-made soil that would be as productive for agriculture as what Emily was already discussing as what naturally happens. And so I think that then bringing that back to the education piece is, I think just any sort of education that is helping students be tied to the land and having that value. I feel very fortunate, as Cese was saying, to work in this area and be paid for what I do. And a lot of that comes from that I grew up being spending time outside and having all those other values, and also valuing food, and then realizing that we have this somewhat broken food system, and tying that back to, I guess, just the environment even more broadly than our food system and what we're doing in agriculture. And so I think anything that can bring students out to the land, and that's actually been a downside right now of COVID. I'm a teaching assistant for one of our second year undergraduate classes here, agroecology, at UBC, and normally these undergrads, 40 undergrads every single week, spend 3 hours at the UBC farm out collecting data. Although collecting data, I'll put in parentheses, because really we're out there and we're collecting data, and it's for these practice data sets for these budding scientists to play around with. But for me in TAing that class, we're taking students out to the UBC farm for 3 hours every week, and they get to meet farmers, they get to see food growing, they get to ask questions, they're out, whether it's rain or it's sun, and oftentimes I'm completely fine with neglecting the data collection if we want to hang out and talk about worms and dig around and look at stuff the whole time. And I know that that course is life-changing for students. And so I think just having, in education, I think it can be hard. We need to have these like tangible, definable outcomes, but I think sometimes the outcomes can just be that students actually asked more questions themselves than maybe were asked of them. I'm not too sure like how that translates into a perfect answer, but I think all of this goes together in just valuing things so that we can have our landscape reflects our values as a society, and if we can change our values, then we can have farmland that's not getting paved over, and that's valued as farmland versus valued as a real estate development.
Yeah, and even when gardening, I can't remember who I read in one of my gardening books. I read at one point that all the same amount of time that you spend like weeding your garden and planting your garden, you should just spend leaning on your hoe, observing, kind of, which comes back to like what Cece is saying as well, and just sort of this like just looking at it, being in it, and sort of like kind of loving it, and that will teach you way more than just doing the work and then getting out of there, which is kind of what you're talking about too, Amy, where it's just like you're just there, like kind of like checking out the worms and like observing, and it's one of the best ways of learning.
Definitely. And I'll add one last thing. I know we're running out of time, but I think I just want to add the irony that I'm studying organic agriculture as a scientist, and we're trying to put values to things, and we're trying to like one of the projects I'm working on is trying to figure out characteristics of compost that we can measure, that we can use to predict how behaves when we add it to the soil. And I love it, and I get so excited when either our work or other people's work shows patterns and there's like these definable characteristics. And then other times it's just the most frustrating thing, and I laugh at myself in terms of we're trying to like put things into boxes, and yet I work in organic agriculture where there is really just this mystery of, and we just need land managers who can use intuition. And so trying to like bring those together, as Cesa has been discussing, sometimes it feels ironic, and sometimes it also feels really perfect to be trying to mesh them together. Anyways, thanks, Emily, for your exhibition or your exhibit. I think that it's been really interesting to look at an artist's interpretation of some of the work that I'm embedded in. It's been great.
Well, we're at that time, and I know that there are a couple of questions unanswered from people who have typed it in, so I do apologize, but we are trying to keep it to a time. On behalf of the Richmond Art Gallery, I thank Emily, Amy, Cease, for participating today. I know we've really not even really scratched the surface. That soil runs very deep. I want to thank Kathy Tykolis, our Education and Public Programs Coordinator, who organized the event, and Melanie DeVoy, our School Art Programmer Coordinator, who guides us through with the much needed technical support that really enables us to do this. And just a couple of final notes. Emily's exhibition sadly closes October the 17th. If you haven't seen it, please come in. It's a wonderful exhibition. And just again, check the gallery's website for details and hours. And thank you to people who have registered and signed in. It's been great to share this afternoon and all the knowledge of our panelists. Thank you. Thank you all. Good afternoon.
Thanks.